It just I wanted to pick symbols that represented all kinds of different religions, but also in terms of Mercedes and Shell, the Shell sign, they represent the whole of the kind of oil industry, who by and large ride roughshod over any kind of ecological needs that the rest of humanity might have. And I think it's really important that those of us who care about global warming or the environment or so on and so forth express the fact that we believe that their need to pay homage to the bottom line in their business overshadows a responsibility that they should have to take care of the environment, because it belongs to all of us, not just the people who own the oil companies or the other big corporations that run the world. Mercedes is a different thing. I've got nothing against Mercedes. I actually own a Mercedes. I'm quite prepared to admit that. But it's a kind of symbol of the excess of luxury that those of us who have cash, and that means a lot of people in the Western world and the Northern Hemisphere take for granted, but that may be something that if we're to share out the wealth of this planet in a fairer way in the future, and hopefully, in consequence, create a world where there is less conflict and less people being blown to bits and less parents losing children and so on and so forth, we may have to be prepared to accept the fact that we may have to settle, you know, for something less elegant.
Now, of course, you got controversy for those images, and the Anti-Defamation League commented that you had crossed the line into anti-Semitism. How did you respond to them?
Well, if you go to my website, you can see how I responded. I wrote what I thought was rather a kind of eloquent letter refuting what he was called Abrams or something. Because he hadn't actually seen the show. He'd read a piece in Rolling Stone, and he was responding to that. And it was just the fact that the $ and the Star of David were on the screen at the same time, where he was saying, oh, you're bringing up all the worst possible, you know, stereotypical anti-Semitic views of Jews and money, and, you know, it's Shakespeare all over again. And he didn't say that. but that's sort of what he meant. And in response to that, I said, it never even occurred to me. I have the hammer and sickle, I have the crescent and the star, I have the crucifix, I have the Star of David, I have the $, I have show. There's a ton of things dropping out. I'm making the point that we are bombarded by ideas, both religious, ideological and commercial, and that causes us pain, and it causes death and suffering and whatever from all of those things. And I'm very even-handed about it. I think they withdrew, kind of quietly licking whatever wounds they had. Not that I intended to. And in fact, I have to say this. I said in my piece, the juxtaposition of these symbols is entirely irrelevant to me, so I changed them. So in the show, I went, it doesn't make any difference to me. I don't care, you know.
It's interesting because there are those who say it's possible to criticize anything in the world, but you can't criticize Israel. And there's often a backlash. We've seen journalists fired for a comment here and there and so on. And I wonder, as someone who's been a staunch activist in the situation with the Israelis and Palestinians, apart from that ADL situation, what sort of backlash you faced over the years?
Well, I'm about to face a bit more because I've just written an op-ed piece, which at the moment, I think they're called the International something for Middle Eastern Understanding or something, are trying to place with either the New York Times, I think, or the Guardian, or somewhere anyway. And it's actually me calling upon my fellow, I banged the mic, calling on my fellow musicians and artists to join the BDS campaign against Israel, because I've finally decided to put my head above the parapet. Enough is enough. They pay lip service to the idea that they want to make peace with the Palestinians, and they sort of talk around the possibility of a two-state solution. But in the meantime, they're throwing people out of their homes in the Negev, in East Jerusalem. They're annexing huge parts of the West Bank. So all this talk about is just they're quietly getting on with taking over the whole of the land. And what happens then to the Palestinians? And I'm really concerned about that, as was my father, interestingly enough. My father taught at St. George's School in Jerusalem from 1936 to 1938, and was very concerned, even then, you know, before the war, before the Holocaust, before all of that, about what was going on in Palestine.
And he died fighting in Italy, I gather. Is that right?
He died at Anzio, fighting the Germans in 1944.
Now, you know, you talked earlier about the concert you did, and we're going to take another look at that documentary, Walled Horizons, where you were playing a concert at Neve Shalom. Let's listen to that.
I may be speaking out of turn, but I believe that we, the rest of the world, need this generation of Israelis to tear down the walls.
How did you gauge the reaction of young people in Israel to that separation barrier and even their current policies towards Palestinians?
Well, you know, there were like 50 or 60,000 of them at that show we just saw, and I didn't get to speak to very many of them. They were extraordinarily enthusiastic, even to songs like Leaving Beirut, which were clearly trying to make the point, you know, that we're all human beings. And that particular song describes an experience of mine being taken in by an Arab family in the Lebanon when I was a very young man and treated with the kind of hospitality that you might, you know, read about in books. The people, they were so kind and hospitable to me. There were one or two responses to that saying, who does he think he is coming here and telling us what we should be doing or whatever. However, I know from many Israeli friends of mine that there is a movement in Israel, not just restricted to young people, but a general movement that we never hear about in the United States of America, of refusing. Kids who refuse to join the army or who leave the Air Force because they disapprove of their country's foreign policy, but also many thousands of Israelis who believe that their government's policies are repressive and racist and colonialist and imperialist and wrong, and who are fighting against it. So any one of us from outside Israel who thinks that Israeli policy is wrong, we're not anti-Semitic, and we're not against Israelis. In fact, we applaud those many of them whose humanity transcends both their religion and any nationalistic fervour that they might regress to. I think we're all human first, and that any movement towards a nationalistic and jingoistic attitudes is a regression into something that is actually beneath us.
Interesting, because I was reading how you'd said that there's a fairly prevalent, quote, cynical view that human beings as a collective are incapable of developing a more humane, that's to say kinder, more generous, more cooperative, more empathetic relationship with one another, and that you disagree. And I wonder what gives you that optimism, considering all you've seen.
I saw it in my mother. I see it in my friends.